Good afternoon, everybody. It's Tuesday, November 23rd. I'm Richard Moore, and this is your Wisconsin Investigator. Today, talking about intersectionalism and climate change in Wisconsin. So, the Democrats in the Wisconsin legislature earlier this month introduced 22 bills related to climate change. It was a breathtaking display of unawareness. Of course, none of the bills stand a chance of passing. The Democrats know this. It's all about catering to the party's base for the next election next year. This is what we stand for, and we want you to be enthused enough to actually go out and vote for Tony Evers. Weak leader that he is, he's going to need every vote. The problem for them is that the policies are so radical by design that they will turn off way more independents, who are mostly turned off already, than they will energize base voters. Now, the package of bills is very radical, which I will talk more about in a second, but what's really significant about them is how woke they are. And this is an essential point. In the old days, when liberals talked about the minimum wage or climate change or gun control, they were talking about, well, the minimum wage or climate change or gun control. Not so anymore. They may give lip service to those issues, but the real goal is to advance woke intersectional politics, namely the idea that all of these other policy arenas are simply vessels of systemic oppression that divide us all into oppressor class and oppressed class, and that bases our identity on that categorization. In these measures, intersectional radicals introduced themselves to climate change activists in a big way. In other words, every aspect of the so-called man-made climate change is a reflection of the oppressor class asserting itself over the oppressed class. Fossil fuels aren't just bad for the environment, they are a tool by which the ruling elite keeps the minions down. And if you are the oppressed class, you must endorse the progressive agenda not only to save the environment, but to liberate yourself. Otherwise, you're clearly a racist. Never mind that the poor will pay disproportionately higher prices for green energy. They will be liberated, sprung from the intersectional divide. Here's how one of the legislation's leading Democrats, Senator Melissa Agard of Madison, put it. Climate change is an intersectional issue, she said, and said it proudly. It is a public health issue, a racial justice issue, an economic issue. We must take this seriously. The time to act is now. In other words, we must impose our climate change agenda upon the state by public health decree if necessary, given that it's a public health emergency, and only this agenda can both save the environment and bring about racial and economic justice. So let's take a look at some of the bills. One of the most dangerous would allow the state superintendent of education to create a model of academic standards related to climate change. Here's the supporting language. If the state superintendent adopts model standards, they would have to incorporate an understanding of climate, the interconnected nature of climate change, the potential local and global impacts of climate change, and the individual and societal actions that may mitigate the harmful effects of climate change. Another way to say all that, they will dictate what will be taught, and what will be taught will be the assessments of the latest United Nations climate report, of the Radical Wisconsin Climate Change Working Group, and of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, all of whom have adopted worst-case scenarios for the future, and all of whom have concluded that close to 100% of climate change is human-made. For Wisconsin, their expectation is that temperatures will rise between 2.5 degrees and 7.5 degrees Fahrenheit in just the next quarter century or so. Does any serious person think that will actually happen? No, and it's not going to happen. But in any case, the policies and the curricula they will design around that policy is based on the most extreme of the temperature range. In other words, they will assume a 7.5 degree increase. It's not only wrong, but these partisans know it's wrong. As Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute has pointed out, the UN projections, and so the Wisconsin projections too, are based on what is known, and this is a mouthful, as Coupled Model Intercomparison Project Phase 6 of the World Climate Research Program, otherwise called CMIP6. But as Burnett reported, the scientists and modelers who constructed the CMIP6 models were recently forced to admit they grossly overestimated past and projected warming, doing even worse than previous generations of models. Here's how Science magazine put it: the climate models that help climate scientists project the future have grown a little too alarmist. Many of the world's leading models are now projecting warming rates that most scientists, including the model makers themselves, believe are plausibly fast. But this alarmism would be what your children would be taught as fact in school if the Democrats have their way. The problem is not that this point of view would be presented to our children. The problem will be that it will be taught as scientific fact, and the other side of a very contentious debate will not be allowed. No one will be taught to think critically, and no debate will be allowed. After all, it's settled science. More than the climate change smoke and mirrors will be the helping of wokeness that will be served up with it. The bill would allow DPI to provide grants or to contract with state agencies or nonprofits to assist in developing the model curricula for elementary, middle, and high school students. In other words, the woke outfits that are already pushing critical race theory curricula in schools. And because the Democrats proclaim in these bills that climate change and other environmental hazards disproportionately impact low income communities and people of color, it will be one more opportunity to propagandize for critical race theory in the guise of teaching climate change science. Quickly, there are other goodies in the bills. The Wisconsin Climate Corps would be established, which would allow local governments, tribal governments, nonprofit corporations, and executive branch agencies to sponsor projects relating to climate resilience and, here it goes, environmental justice. The bill would create more government, new positions in the UW Extension and county conservation departments to proselytize for climate change. They would force local governments to include an assessment of the impacts of climate change when they prepare their comprehensive plans, community health plans, or disaster mitigation plans. And they would require the Public Service Commission to consider the social cost of carbon for new utility scale generation, raising costs for everyone, and especially raising costs on the low income. The bottom line is, it would do us all well these days to read the fine print of any proposal coming out of the Democratic Party and the progressive left. Chances are what the proposals are all about are not what they say they are about. Chances are they are about intersectional politics. In reality, though, intersectional politics is little more than the intersection of ideology and power to create a new oppression, namely the suppression of democracy through the resegregation of society into narrow identities of good and evil. Evers' progressive proposal, and those of the Democrats, needs to be vetted for those intentions. I hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving holiday, and I hope you'll share this with your friends and neighbors and colleagues. Thanks very much, and I'll see you later.